I've been playing chess for over 30 years, and if I had to summarize everything that I've learned in 30 years of playing into one sentence, I think I'd have to agree with Capablanca when he said this. The main thing is to develop the pieces quickly, get them into play as fast as you can. I think a lot of people think that they know that, but they don't do it in the right way. Today, you're going to see an example of how Black completely takes over the game against D4, somebody who attempted to play the Kali system. They kind of did, but kind of also didn't, which we'll see in just a second. But Black takes over the game, and you're going to see how that quick development helped them to accomplish this. This is another game from the book Logical Chess, Move by Move. Hopefully you've been following the series with us. If not, that's okay. This is a standalone episode. You're going to learn a ton. Let's go ahead and jump right in. So white plays D4, and the first thing that the author mentions here are 10 principles. And the quote that I just read to you from Capablanca is actually Capablanca summarizing those 10 principles about starting the game. So I'm just going to read them to you quickly. In case you don't have the book, you'll be able to just follow along. Number 1, begin with E4 or D4. Number 2, anchor at least one pawn in the center and give it support. Number 3, whenever possible, bring out your knights before your bishops to either F3 and C3 or F6 and C6. Number 4, of 2 developing moves, select the more aggressive one and develop with the threat when you can. Number 5, move each piece in the opening only one time. Number 6, move at most 2 pawns in the early stages of the game. Play with your pieces, and when he says pieces, he's talking specifically about the knights and the bishops, sometimes the queen and rooks, but generally the knights and the bishops. Next, develop the queen, but close to home to avoid being harassed. Number 9, do not chase after pawns at the expense of development. And the last, number 10, secure the safety of the king by early castling, preferably on the king side. And then Capablanca summarized all 10 of those by saying the main thing is to develop the pieces quickly and get them into play as fast as you can. Like I said, from 30 years of playing, I think that's absolutely correct. Okay, so let's go ahead and see exactly how that happens. So Black plays knight to F6, takes away the E4 square from the pawn. A great developing move, puts the knight on one of the best squares. White plays knight to F3. And here he mentioned something. So we just saw one of the principles was develop the knights before the bishops, usually, right? Do you guys know why? Why is that a principle? What's important about developing the knights before the bishops? Well, if you had a chance to think about that, the main reason is that we always know that, not always, but we most of the time know that this is where the knights are going to be best placed. F3, C3, F6, and C6. Bishops, usually you don't know at the start of the game. Because bishops have a lot of options. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. And usually their best square depends on what your opponent is doing. So the longer you can wait to develop the bishops, the more information you'll have, the better chance of putting that bishop on the best square. When it comes to the knights, it's like, well, I'm pretty much going to always want to put it here anyway. So get those there right away, wait and see what your opponent does, and then you make the decision on the bishops a little bit later. Okay, let's keep going. So Black plays the move E6, lets out the bishop, gets ready to maybe support D5 at some point in the future. Knight B to D2. So White is kind of going for a Kali system setup. Okay, this is one of the moves that you would play in the Kali, and we're going to see how they sort of do that, but then they also do some other stuff, and we'll talk about that in just a second. C5. Okay, so Black immediately is striking at the center, and they do have it supported by this bishop. If White were to take that, they would simply develop and recapture at the same time, which would be pretty nice for them. And they are threatening to take this. And if they're able to take right now, it would force White to recapture with the knight, and they've eliminated one of those center pawns, which is usually a pretty good thing. So what does White do in response? Defends with the pawn so they can recapture with another pawn. Okay? B6. All right. So sometimes when you play the move E6, your bishop is now stuck, right? It can't get out because the pawns are in the way. Even if you move this pawn, it's still going to be stuck behind this E6 pawn. So a good solution is to fianchetto the bishop along this diagonal. And that's what Black is doing with this move. And we're going to see how this could be a very powerful bishop as the game goes on. Okay? So bishop to D3, bishop to B7, castles, and bishop to E7. Both players following the principles, developing quickly, getting their kings to safety. And here white plays an interesting move. White plays the move c4. Now, up until this point, they've pretty much been playing all the moves that you would normally play in the Kali system. So when you play the Kali, white would put a pawn on d4. We would have their knights like this, the pawn on e3, bishop on d3. But usually in the Kali, and especially if black is playing c5 and attacking on d4, you would play the move c3. And you would get this kind of nice pawn pyramid here where everything is nice and solid. And if black ever takes, you simply retake and you have this nice pawn chain. And white deviates from that plan here and plays the move c4. Now, is that a bad move? Not necessarily. However, there are drawbacks to playing this move. And I would like you guys to think what might be a drawback from playing the move c4 instead of c3. All right, well, I already kind of mentioned one thing is that you lose the support on d4. You don't have as much support there, right? Because the pawn is forward. But there's another thing that we're going to see in a few moves. You lose control of the b4 square. And at this moment in the game, you might not think much of that, but watch what happens as we go. And just keep that in the back of your mind as we look at the rest of this game, okay? So c4, white's being a little bit overly aggressive, you might say. Black castles, gets the king out of the center. b3, all right, so white is getting ready to fianchetto their bishop as well to get it into the game. Nothing really crazy there here. Black plays the move d5. Now, I want to ask you guys a question about this move d5. Is it a bad move because it blocks the bishop, yes or no? What do you think? Do you think this is a bad move because it blocks the bishop? Well, the answer to that question is no. It's not a bad move. And the reason is because this is only temporary. And you're getting other things in return by playing that. Number one, you've cleared some space for your knight if you want to put your knight on d7. You've also kind of activated the queen. So now if this pawn ever trades, the queen is involved. If you never push this pawn forward, the queen's going to kind of be stuck back here. It's not really able to get into the game. So there's always trade-offs, especially when you move pawns. There's usually some negatives and some positives. You could say that, yeah, a negative is you temporarily block the bishop, but the benefits, I think, outweigh that. And like I said, it's going to be super easy because these pawns are here to trade this if you need to in the future. Okay. Now, white plays the move. Let's see, what does white play here? Queen to c2. Yeah, queen to c2. It looks like a pretty logical move, right? Like, okay, what's white trying to do? Well, they want to add more support to e4, which is a typical Kali move. They're creating a battery here with the bishop and the queen lining up over here. So if we move our knight, we lose the pawn. But it's actually a bit of a mistake, and they're actually going to get into trouble from playing this move. Now, I would like you guys to pause. Why in the world, or how in the world, I should say, can white get into trouble this early in the game from playing such a logical-looking move like queen to c2? What do you guys think the answer is? All right, well, if you had a chance to look at that, for those of you who read the book, you know that the answer is because of knight to c6. Now, knight to c6, oh yeah, I'm going to talk about this in just a second. We're going to talk about the pawn tension. But first, knight to c6 has a very simple threat. Knight to b4. And remember, in these d4 openings especially, this bishop is one of white's good attacking pieces. Okay, so if black is able to simply go there, gain some time, kicking the queen around, and then trade that off, that's a very nice trade for black. Black would be very happy to do that. So white says, okay, that's pretty annoying. I better defend against that, and they play the move a3. And this is why white starts to get into trouble, because they're wasting time. Instead of doing what Capablanca said, developing as quickly and getting the pieces into play as fast as they can, they're making a pawn move to stop a threat. Now, this was a legitimate threat. I'm not saying that this is a totally crazy move, but you can see how they're starting to fall behind. Black plays a developing move and threatens this, and now white has to stop and make a pawn move. Okay? Now, let's think back. Do you remember when white made the decision to push this pawn to c4 instead of going to c3 in the normal spirit of the Kali? Imagine if the pawn was on c3. Would this even be a concern? The answer is no, right? You would just take the knight. You can see how the Kali system has the setup that it has for a reason, right? And you have to really be careful if you're going to deviate from that if you don't understand the risks associated with that, okay? And I think that's what happened here. White was kind of trying to do a little bit of Kali, but a little bit of some other stuff, like by playing c4 and b3 and now a3, and they end up getting into trouble because of that, okay? Now, before we move on, we do need to talk about this because there is a lot of pawn tension here. And actually, I'll go ahead and make white's move. There's a lot of pawn tension here. I think a lot of beginners, even intermediate players, really struggle when there's so much tension. So usually the way that I like to think about it is don't trade unless there's a specific benefit that you're getting, or if you're going to get into trouble if white captures against you. Okay? So usually you just leave it until there's a moment when you see, aha, I can make these trades, and then I'm going to end up in a good position. Now, this is not a super easy thing to do. Okay? This is not a beginner level thing because there's so much tension, you have to do a lot of calculating. Usually it's going to involve calculating at least 4 lines. Because if you think about it, you have to calculate, do I want to take here? Do I want to take here? Or do I want to leave it and let white take here, or leave it and let white take here? Right? That's a lot to think about. So if you are a beginner, don't get overwhelmed. Just know this might be something that you work up towards, right? Where you have to start kind of calculating through these lines. But it's best to just do them one at a time. Like, okay, what's going to happen most likely if I take? And what's white going to do? Okay, what if I take this way? What's going to happen? It's also tricky, right? Because there's multiple options. You take here, white could take with the pawn, or white could take with the knight. And again, if you're calculating 4 initial lines, but now you're branching off and each one of those maybe has 2, now you're at 8 lines. And it can get to be a lot, okay? So, yeah, hopefully that helps you. And you're going to see as we go through this game what I'm talking about when I say, like, look for opportunities to improve your position. But I actually think it might be the next move. Let me see what happens next here. Yeah, c takes d4, exactly. So black was scanning and was looking for, wait a second, do I have any opportunities? I think I see one. I'm going to choose to make the trade because of the benefit that I get from it. Okay, so what benefit does black get from this? Well, I want to ask you guys, what happens if white simply recaptures with the pawn? Black had a nice response lined up here. What do you guys think they were going to play against this? Well, the answer is they're going to capture again to unleash the queen. And now they have 2 pieces lined up on the pawn. It's only defended 1 time. So their threat is actually very, very simple. They just want to win a pawn. So for example, if white recaptures, thank you very much. I just got a free pawn. It's literally that simple. So white was probably going to have to take with the queen to add a defender. But now you can play rook to c8, and you're lining up on the queen. This is a very uncomfortable position for white to be in. Okay? Another example here, let's go back, is if white captures with the knight. So just to remind you where we are here, after the trade, we looked at what happens if they take with the pawn. We take, and we're going to try to win the pawn. If they take with the knight, we can actually do the same thing. We throw in the trade first, then we take, and again, we have the threat on the pawn. If they take with the pawn or the bishop or the knight, they simply lose a pawn. If they take with the queen, again, we can bring the rook over. And there's actually this really interesting line here I wanted to show you guys. Queen to a4. We attack the queen, and uh-oh, we lost a pawn. What are we doing? What's the move for black? That's correct. Rook to a8 traps the queen. The queen has no squares to go to. Look at that. And that's a sad day for the white queen. Okay? So, and all that happened from a simple decision by black to liquidate the pawn tension because they saw this idea of a weak pawn on d4. Right? And it's usually something simple like that, like a weak pawn or maybe a weak piece. And you look for those opportunities and you take advantage of it. Right? And that's exactly what black is doing. And it's important to notice, black has all the pieces ready to go and white does not. They are behind in development because they had to waste some time with this a3 move, right? Very, very important, okay? So they take, and because of what I just mentioned, right, about what's going to happen if white does this, white makes the decision. Instead of that, let me try to mix it up here and take the other way. Okay. So how does black respond? If you guys want to pause for a second, what do you think the move is here? All right, if you had a chance to look at that, black simply takes this opportunity to activate the queen. Okay, puts the queen on a nice square. Usually when the queen goes to d5, I'm worried about knight to c3 to chase it away. That knight's already been moved, so we don't have to worry about that. There's e4 or bishop c4, but they're not like serious threats. We could just simply move our queen somewhere. The game's going to go on, and there's nothing really bad about this. It does connect our rooks, which is always a good thing. Gives the rooks options to go wherever they want to. And you could have also taken with the knight. That wouldn't have been the end of the world. However, there's one little problem with this move. That's correct. The battery here, and you would lose a pawn. You'd have to waste some time moving. That's probably not what you want to do. Okay, so that's why I think taking with the queen makes the most sense. All right, let's keep going. So white recaptures with the pawn, and as you will notice, there's 2 attackers and there's only 1 defender, so black simply wins a pawn. Okay, and so the whole point of that liquidating the pawn tension was to win a pawn, which black does. All right, let's keep going. Here's a very interesting moment actually in the game. So white has the decision. Do you take the knight or do you save the queen? What do you guys think? What do they take the knight or do they move the queen? Well, the answer is you have to move the queen. You have to move the queen because if you take this knight, the game is over immediately. Checkmate from the battery. And that's it. So you can't do that. Okay, the knight cannot move. Very, very powerful battery, this bishop and this queen. Remember, I talked about it earlier. The fianchettoed bishop can get very, very powerful as the position opens up, and that's what we see here. Okay. So white has to move the queen. There's a couple of options, and pretty much all of them are bad. For example, queen to b2. If you leave the bishop undefended, you simply lose the bishop. Okay, because you can take there with a check, force the recapture, and then you just grab the bishop. So with that in mind, white decided to go queen b1 to keep that guy defended. So now if you try to trade, you're not winning a piece. Okay? So what do you think black played in this position? If you had a chance to look at that, they just brought in one of the pieces that wasn't doing anything. Rook f to d8. So this rook was kind of just sitting over there. Now it's another battery. Okay, so you've got actually have 2 batteries here. Queen and bishop over here, which we saw the danger of that. And now you have the rook and the queen, again, threatening that bishop. So if white is not paying attention, does some random move, guess what? I'm going to take here, and I'm going to win the bishop for free because it's now defended by my rook. Okay, so these batteries are very, very powerful. And I actually want to mention something here. I put together, it's a free PDF, okay, and it has like 10 middle game plans. It's called 10 middle game moves, but it's essentially 10 middle game plans, things that you can do in the middle of the game if you're like stuck on what to do. Okay, so let me just show you that really quickly. And the reason I'm showing you this is because number 1 on this thing, let me actually see if I can just drag this over. I don't know how this is going to look. Here we go. This is the PDF that I created. And number 1 on the list is create a battery on a file. Okay, and I got to talk through what's a battery, why do you want to do that, why is it important. I give you some like quiz questions, like you can practice. And there's 10 other, or there's 10 total, so there's 9 other different ones. This is totally free. Links in the description if you want to get that. I put a lot of time trying to make it look nice and be helpful. So I just wanted to mention that because that's literally what black is doing here, right? They've created the battery here, they've created the battery here, and we're already seeing how powerful those are. Okay, so links in the description. Check it out if you want. No pressure, but it is totally free. All right, let's keep going. So white has to make a tough decision again, right? Because again, we have the threat on the bishop, which I already showed you. So what do? They really had 2 options here. And option number 1 was bringing the bishop back to c2. So just saying, look, I just got to get away from the queen and the rook. Let me just go back here. The problem with this is that black actually had their choice now of 3 different things that they could do. Let me see. So number 1, you could just start trading some stuff. Okay, and as a general rule, trading pieces when you're ahead is good. So remember, black won the pawn, so they have 4 pawns against 3. So trading pieces makes a lot of sense. And black's getting a little bit closer to the end of the game. Up a pawn, totally great position. Nothing wrong with that. That was option number 1. Option number 2 is they could have just brought another piece over and just continued to build the pressure and just continued to pile on. They already have so many threats. Just keep adding threats. Or number 3, and arguably the best, I say arguably, it is the best, is look for a tactic. Look for some sort of combination that could lead to an even better position. So this is a little bit more advanced, but if you would like to pause here and look for some sort of tactic or combination that black has in this position. All right, if you had a chance to look at that, the move is knight to e2 check. And it's forcing the king to move. Obviously, only move for white. King to h1. And then you could follow up with this move bishop to a6, lining up here, threatening now to move the knight, like let's just say to c3, attacking the queen and also attacking the rook at the same time. So if white tries to deal with that by sliding the rook over, You can now jump in with knight to g4. And guys, there's a lot of moves that could have been played here, so I'm not showing you every single variation for the sake of simplicity, but this is one of the main lines that could have happened, right? You jump in, threatening to take here. So white says, okay, let me defend that with my knight. And then you have this amazing move. If you want to pause again, this one's a little bit easier. Black to play, what's the best move? That's correct. Queen takes e4. And when they recapture, there's no piece now defending here. And this is actually checkmate with the knights. We're on move 18, and you just checkmated the white king with your knights on f2 and e2. I mean, just think about that for a second. 18 moves against a d4 opening, which is usually considered pretty solid, and you checkmate him with knights on f2 and e2. Mind-boggling when you think about that, okay? So, that's probably black's most powerful move, knight to e4 check. And by the way, I want to just pause and illustrate something really important here. If you ask the question, how did white get into this trouble? Like, how could that be there? Like, 18 moves and you're getting checkmated by 2 knights? How is that possible? Let me tell you why. Look at the queen. Look at the queen. Look at all the spaces that it can go to. That is a very powerful queen. Let's compare that to this queen. Nope, not really doing much. Okay, let's compare this knight to this knight. Look at my knight. This knight is just attacking all sorts of things, sitting in the center. It's super powerful. This knight, not so much, doing a little bit. Let's compare this bishop to this bishop. Nope, not doing anything. Look at my bishop, working with the queen, creating this amazing battery. Look at this rook, working with the queen, creating the battery. Look at this rook. Nope, not doing anything. So when you put all of those pieces together, okay, it's primarily these 4 compared to these 4. Look at the difference. Look at the difference in the activity, in the squares that they're controlling, in the power that those 4 black pieces have compared to white's 4 pieces. I mean, it's not even close, right? And that is why, and that's a key. That's a key in your mind of like, yeah, there's probably a good tactic here. There's probably something really strong here because I have so many active pieces and white doesn't. Okay? And that's really what the major difference was. All right? So let's keep going. And all of that was if white had decided to play bishop to c2 to get away from this threat, right? So they probably saw some of that. And because of that, decided, nope, I don't want to do that. I'm going to play knight to e1 instead. And knight to e1 is actually a nice defensive try because you're defending the checkmate, okay? And you're also defending the bishop. So temporarily, it looks like white's doing pretty well. They've dealt with the major issues. If you look around, this is attacked twice, but it's defended twice. We've talked about the attack here, but now it's defended. This is attack, but it's everything seems to be defended, okay? So, good moment to pause. What do you play here as black? How do you go forward? All right, if you had a chance to look at that. The move is, and there's a couple of moves you could play, but the move is queen to h5. Now, why would we move a queen away from here, just way over here? What's going on? The idea is actually tied to something that I want to remind you guys of. So when we first started this series, we talked about attacking on the king side. And there was 2 things that we said. 2 things that we said were very, very critical, if you remember, from the very first episode. What were those 2 things that you had to think about when you were attacking on the king side? Number 1 was, have any of these pawns been moved forward? Because if so, they've created weaknesses that you can take advantage of. And number 2 was if the knight was no longer on f3. Guess what? The knight is no longer on f3. It's been moved away. And whenever that happens, it's weaker on the king side. And one example is the h2 square, because normally there's a knight defending it, but it's not there. So black is saying, okay, I'm going to shift my focus really quickly to attack here. Next move, knight to g4 or bishop to d6 is probably going to happen. And that's not easy for white to deal with because you can't even really go back there because we've got that covered by two pieces, right? We'll just take that knight. So do you see what the logic is to come up with this idea, right? Stockfish actually says you should go bishop d6 first right away. I guess it wants you to leave the battery for one more move. But both moves kind of have the same idea. Okay, so in the game, queen h5 was played. Hope that makes sense why that was played. All right. So white at this point says, well, I don't really know what to do. I probably should continue developing. So they play bishop to b2 to get their bishop out. Because, I mean, what else are they going to play? And again, we see the follow-up, kind of like I just mentioned, bishop to d6. Okay, black says, let's go ahead, create the checkmate threat, taking advantage of the fact, like I mentioned before, the knight is not on f3. Okay, the knight's been moved. And if you try to go there now, like I said, we just take it. And we just take it. And at the end of the day, there's a checkmate. Okay, very straightforward. So what options does white have instead to defend? Well, let's take a look at them. They could have also played the move h3. Trying to block off the queen here. There's a very nice move here that black has if you would like to pause. This one, maybe it's a little bit more difficult to see, but go ahead. All right, if you had a chance to look at that. So the best move and the Stockfish approved move is bishop takes g2. Bishop takes g2, busting open the king side. Now in the book, he doesn't mention this move. Okay, I think this book was written before Stockfish was like what it is today. And in the book, he mentions queen e5, which is also a very powerful move, threatening checkmate that way. And after something like g3, then you go to d5, threatening checkmate again. And he says this is good for black, which it is. Stockfish just finds this move, king h2, defending the checkmate by allowing the rook to come over. And somehow Stockfish says white is like holding on in this position a little bit. So that's why the Stockfish move is bishop takes g2. Okay, what's the point? Well, if you take with the knight, the queen comes down, and this is happening. You just can't get away from this. Okay, if you play f4, there's knight to g4. So you can't do that. You've got to take it with the king. But if you take with the king, there's this absolutely ridiculous line, which actually makes sense, but it's very long, and it's a Stockfish move. It's mate in 15 or something like that, and it goes like this. Queen g5 check, king here, queen f4, so you're threatening checkmate on h2. The knight tries to defend, you take. It's defended temporarily, so you take this with check. King moves there. You take that, threatening checkmate again on h2. The pawn moves here. Check again. You block. You take. The knight jumps in. Check. 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 Checkmate. I think that was 15 moves or something like this. Close to that. All right, and a lot of those moves were pretty logical. Okay, but the point is, you had all your pieces set up. You sacrifice bishop, bust open the king, and then even if you didn't see that, I think you could safely play this move. You could safely play this move on the basis that, just look at his king. Look at all these pieces. It's going to be a good move. Now, whether or not you find the checkmate is debatable, obviously, but it's still a great move. Okay. Wow. That was all if white plays h3. Okay? So remember, we're still trying to stop this checkmate, and white's trying to figure out what to do. They can't move their knight. They could try h3. Probably don't want to do that. They could try f4 is one that I haven't showed yet. Let me look at this one really quick. Bishop c5. Lines up here, very, very annoying. You try to get out of it, and then knight g4 comes. And here, again, we see the checkmate on h2. White tries to block that off. If you would like to pause, what's the move here for black? Well, you simply take the pawn, because this guy's pinned by the bishop, and then it leads to a checkmate on h2. Okay, man. So white is just getting all sorts of, I don't even know what to say, just checkmates and threats and tactics everywhere. And so they decide the best option to deal with the checkmate is g3. Okay? They're going to try to stop it like this. So the game goes on. And what move do you think black played next? You get a chance to look at that. The move is knight to g4. And basically just continuing to attack the weak spots, right? And since the bishop was shut off, okay, you bring in another piece that was kind of just sitting there. And now, again, white has the problem of how do you deal with this? You can't use the knight. We already talked about it, because we just take. We just take, and it's still there, so that doesn't help. And so white says, all right, I better play h4. And now what does black play? You get a chance to look at that. Absolutely stunning move. Queen takes h4. And you're coming through. And, of course, if they take your queen, you don't care, because checkmate with the bishop. Remember, this guy is slicing across, and this is defending. Wow, knight and two bishops, checkmating the king. I mean, it's almost like, what did white even do wrong? You look at this game, and it's like, oh, wait a second. You played pretty much good moves. So I actually, after you've had a moment to like just enjoy this checkmate, I want to go back and look at the game one more time and ask the question, wait a second, where exactly did white go wrong, right? Because this seemed like white was a good player. I mean, look at what white's doing. You're playing d4. You're developing your pieces. You're setting up the collie, very solid setup. You're not wasting time doing stupid stuff. You're doing what you're supposed to. You castle. Okay, you played c4. Okay, so a small thing by not putting the pawn where it probably belonged. Okay, you played b3. That's a good move, getting your bishop out. Right here, probably white should have continued by getting the bishop out, not wasting the time with the queen, because remember, this was a very annoying threat. Imagine if you would have played bishop to b2, knight c6. Now I'm not so worried about this, right? Because now, I could just move my bishop. It's not like I'm losing my bishop. So maybe that would have been the way to go for white. So you make this really subtle, maybe mistake of queen c2, and then you waste a little bit of time on a3, and then a few trades later, you're down a pawn. There's a checkmate being threatened here if you move your knight, so you have to waste some more time. And remember what Capablanca said, quickly developing the pieces. And look at this. This guy was stuck. This guy was stuck for how many moves? Didn't ever get the pieces into the game, right? And then you have to make this awkward decision to go back, which just blocks in everything. The rook is stuck. You're going backwards. You're losing control over the board. You've moved your knight from the king side, which is not a good sign, right? All of these things. And the next thing you know, there it is. The checkmate threat and the sacrifice in the game is over. It literally happened that fast. Wow. Hope you guys enjoyed that. Let's go ahead and jump into some questions from the previous week. And don't forget, download that middle game guide if you want some more plans for the middle game. All right, let's see the questions. All right, so first question from last week from Graham Dugan was in this position right here. So black played the French, got into a really passive position. White's trying to figure out how to attack. And I had asked, what move should white play? And the answer was queen to c2, creating the battery to threaten on h7 and induce some weaknesses. But the question was, what about bishop takes h7, a Greek gift sacrifice, to get the king out and then attack it? And the first thing that I'll say is it's not a terrible idea. Stockfish actually doesn't mind it too much, although it does give a slight advantage to black after you play this move. And one thing that you want to remember is when you play the Greek gift sacrifice, usually the point is to play knight to g5 next, and then jump in with the queen and go for a checkmate on h7. That's pretty much the idea, right? But in this case, if we try to play knight to g5 check, what's the problem? Well, there's a bishop sitting here that would just take us. And it's not defended, and we just lost a piece, right? You could still play queen to d3 check, but since you're not really able to get the knight in, you don't have a follow-up, right? You need that knight to be able to go to g5. Okay, so that's a really key feature in the Greek gift sacrifice. If you can't, for some reason, either play knight to g5 or get your queen in afterwards, then usually the Greek gift is not going to be the way to go. Okay, but good question. It's good to always be thinking about those things. Like maybe that's a possibility, and then you need to understand if it works or not. Okay, so good question. Yeah, a question from Suma D Haripali 5298, if I pronounced that correctly, asked, if black didn't castle, then the center's closed. White can't get to the king. It also prevents black from playing f6 to open up the game. How do I attack the king when the center is closed to take advantage of the fact that the opponent's pieces are so passive? Okay, so if black didn't castle and did something else, now it's a question of like what would they have played, right? Because they don't really have a lot of moves. Let's say they would have played a6 because they're well, actually white's turn. White castled. Let's say black would have played something like a6. Okay, they're just like, I don't want to castle. I'm just going to do this. How would you attack? This is the question. How would you attack the king if it's in the center? The first thing I'll say is it's not going to be easy to do in a closed off center. Okay, when the center is closed, it's not easy to attack a king in the center. It's just not. And what you will notice actually is a lot of people who play the French won't castle for a while. Sometimes even the whole game. Like a lot of times they'll just leave the king sit there. And if the center is still closed, they're totally fine with that. And in a lot of cases, that is the better choice. I think Stockfish doesn't mind some of these moves like a6 to just leave the king in the center. So there's no easy answer to the question. If I was going to attack, I would probably personally try to get my f-pawn forward, because if I could get that there, I could see that king would be in trouble. Not that easy to do, right? Because if I just move my knight to try to play f4, well, then black's going to actually start getting some counterplay here. And I don't really know what's going on. I guess Stockfish says this is okay. You could still do this, but yeah, it's really not. Then you have to go back to f3. It's like, what did I even just do that for? So to answer your question, this is one of the exceptions when it's okay to not castle and leave your king in the center if it's locked up, okay? Because there's just not an easy way to get through. So good question. There's no easy answer to how to attack, okay? All right, guys. I hope that was helpful. I'll see you in the next episode. Next time, we're going to look at game number 12, which starts on page 70 in the book. All right. See you guys next time. Stay sharp, play smart, and take care.